In the West, the hardest trails are not on any map. They are the paths of the heart, where courage is measured by compassion, not by the gun. Elara Vance did not seek trouble. The dust of Red Creek clung to the hem of her simple calico dress as she made her way toward the stagecoach office. Her father, the late Dr. Vance, had taught her that the quietest path was often the wisest. She was only in town to collect a package of medical supplies, a routine task. But the rhythm of the town was wrong today. A knot of men had gathered near the saloon, their voices a low grumble that promised conflict. A heavy freight wagon stood nearby, its canvas cover stained with the grime of a long journey. Elara felt a familiar prickle of unease, the kind that always preceded a storm, both in the sky and in the hearts of men. She tried to walk past, her gaze fixed on the distant post office. The shouting grew louder, impossible to ignore. Corbin Blackwood, a merchant with a reputation as tarnished as his brass buttons, stood before his wagon. He was berating 3 young women. Their faces were pale with exhaustion, their dresses little more than rags. Elara recognized them as the Pierce sisters, orphaned last winter when fever took their parents. Blackwood had taken them on as his wards, a supposed act of charity. But the way he spoke to them was anything but charitable. "You will do as you are told, or you will feel the back of my hand," he snarled, his voice carrying across the dusty street. The crowd watched, a mixture of pity and fear on their faces, but no one moved to intervene. When Blackwood grabbed the youngest sister, Cora, by the arm, something inside Elara snapped. She stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension. "Mr. Blackwood, release her." He turned, surprised. "This is not your concern, Miss Vance." "The well-being of the people in this town was always my father's concern," she replied, her tone firm. "And now it is mine." In the crowd, a lone Arapaho warrior, known to the townsfolk only as Boriviter, watched with dark, unreadable eyes. As one of Blackwood's men moved toward Elara, Boriviter let out a soft cough. The distraction was brief, but it was enough. Elara stood her ground, unflinching. To avoid the involvement of the sheriff, who was slow but honest, Elara made an offer. "I will pay their indenture. Name your price." Blackwood, seeing the determined look in her eyes and the silent support she was gathering from the crowd, hesitated. He named a sum that was nearly all Elara had left of her inheritance. Without a word, she agreed. The exchange was made, the papers signed with a grim finality. Blackwood glared at her, his eyes promising retribution. Elara ignored him. She turned to the 3 silent, frightened sisters. "Come with me," she said softly. "You are safe now." And she led them away from the dusty street, toward her quiet home on the edge of town. The Vance homestead, perched on a hill overlooking the valley, had been a silent place since the doctor's passing. Elara lived surrounded by his books and medical instruments, a solitary existence. For the Pierce sisters, the house was a sanctuary, yet the quiet was filled with an unspoken tension. Eleanor, the eldest, kept her hand near the hilt of a small knife hidden in the folds of her skirt, her eyes constantly scanning the windows. Her trust had been broken too many times. Beatrice, gentle and shy, moved through the house like a phantom, helping Elara with chores, her gratitude a silent prayer. Cora, the youngest, found a strange comfort in the doctor's anatomical charts, her youthful curiosity a small light in the gloom. A few days later, Sheriff Brody paid a visit, his horse kicking up dust as it climbed the hill. He was a good man, a friend of Elara's father, but his face was etched with worry. "Elara, you have made a powerful enemy," he said, accepting a glass of water. "Blackwood does not forgive easily. Offering shelter to those girls, it could bring you a world of trouble." He shifted his weight, his gaze drifting toward the distant mountains. "And I have heard whispers. They say you have been seen speaking with the Arapaho." He did not say Boriviter's name, but Elara knew who he meant. The town's fear of the unknown was a palpable thing. Ilara met the sheriff's gaze, her own resolve hardening. She had inherited her father's stubborn streak along with his medical books. "My father taught me to help those in need, Sheriff, regardless of their name or the color of their skin. This house will remain a refuge for anyone who requires it." Her voice was quiet but held a core of steel. Brody sighed, running a hand over his tired face. "I know. Your father was the same. A fine man, but he never chose the easy path." He looked at the three sisters huddled on the porch. "Just be careful, Ilara. The world is not as kind as you wish it to be. Blackwood has friends in low places." After the sheriff left, a heavy silence fell over the homestead. Eleanor watched Ilara with a new intensity. "Why did you do it?" she asked, her voice raspy. "He could have ruined you." Ilara looked out at the vast, unforgiving landscape. "Because no one else would," she answered simply. "Because my father believed that a single act of courage could change the world, even if it is just the world of 3 people. That night, for the first time, Eleanor put her knife away before she went to sleep. A fragile seed of trust had been planted in the hard soil of her heart. The house on the hill was no longer just a shelter. It was becoming a home. A few days later, Ilara was gathering herbs by the creek that bordered her property. The air was still, broken only by the buzz of insects and the gentle murmur of the water. Suddenly, a low groan from the thicket of willows startled her. Pushing aside the branches, she found Borivider. He was leaning against a tree, his face pale, a dark stain spreading across the shoulder of his deerskin shirt. An arrow, crudely made and fletched with crow feathers, protruded from the wound. "Blackwood's men," he said through gritted teeth. "They waited for me on the trail." He had been returning to his people's camp when they ambushed him. Without hesitation, Ilara helped him to his feet and led him back to the house. Eleanor met them at the door, her hand instinctively going to her knife, but Ilara's sharp look stopped her. She guided Borivider to a chair in the main room, the sisters watching with wide, fearful eyes. "Boil water," Ilara commanded, already reaching for her father's medical bag. She worked with a calm efficiency that belied the tremor in her hands. She carefully cut the arrow shaft, her movements precise. Borivider watched her, his expression a mixture of pain and surprise. He had never seen a woman work with such confidence, her touch both gentle and firm. As she cleaned the wound, he spoke, his voice low. "My people use willow bark for the pain. It eases the fire." Ilara nodded, preparing a needle and thread. "My father used it as well. He said knowledge has many roots, and all are nourished by the same earth." She began to stitch the wound, her technique clean and practiced. He did not flinch. "Your hands do not tremble," he observed. "They have no reason to," she replied, her focus absolute. This was not a lecture, but a quiet exchange between 2 people who understood the delicate balance of healing. It was a conversation that transcended words, building a bridge of mutual respect between their 2 worlds. During his recovery, a quiet routine settled in the house. Borivider, unable to travel, taught the sisters how to read animal tracks in the dust and how to predict the weather by the movement of the clouds. In the evenings, Ilara would read to him from her father's books of poetry, his deep voice occasionally joining hers in a soft murmur. A connection was forming between them, unspoken but powerful. It was a bond forged in shared danger and quiet understanding, a fragile thing that both frightened and fascinated them. The house on the hill was no longer silent. It was filled with the low hum of a new, unexpected life. Corbin Blackwood was not a man to be trifled with. Unable to act openly against Ilara for fear of Sheriff Brody, he chose a more insidious path. Whispers began to circulate in Red Creek, venomous as rattlesnakes. They said Ilara had taken up with savages, that she was practicing dark arts taught to her by heathens. The townspeople, once respectful of Dr. Vance's daughter, now crossed the street to avoid her. Her weekly trips for supplies became ordeals of cold shoulders and hostile stares. Ilara felt the isolation like a physical weight, but she refused to let it break her spirit. She knew this was Blackwood's doing, a war of attrition meant to drive her out. The harassment escalated. One night, a volley of shots shattered the quiet, the bullets thudding into the wooden walls of the house. No one was hurt, but the message was clear. Another morning, Ilara found a crude symbol, a twisted cross meant to signify a curse, painted on her front door in what looked like animal blood. Fear, cold and sharp, began to creep into the house. Alara knew they could not live like this. She retrieved her father's old Winchester rifle from its case. It was time to fight back, not with aggression, but with preparation. She would not be a victim in her own home. She began to teach the sisters to shoot. Eleanor, her jaw set with grim determination, proved to be a natural. The rifle felt steady in her hands, its cold weight a comfort. She found an outlet for her protective instincts in the sharp crack of the firearm and the satisfying thud of a bullet hitting its target. Beatrice, though her hands trembled, learned to load and reload with surprising speed, her quiet nature hiding a steely resolve. Even young Cora, her fear warring with a fierce desire to protect her new family, practiced throwing knives at a wooden post, her aim growing truer with each attempt. Boriviter watched their training with a quiet approval. He did not interfere, but offered advice when asked. He showed them how to use the terrain to their advantage, how to build small, defensible positions using rocks and fallen logs. "The land can be your greatest ally," he told them, his voice a low rumble. "It offers shelter to those who know how to listen." He taught them to think not just as targets, but as hunters. The homestead was no longer just a house. It was becoming a fortress. And its inhabitants were no longer just 4 women and a wounded man. They were a family, forged in adversity and ready to defend their home. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, they sat around the hearth. The fire cast dancing shadows on the walls, a stark contrast to the growing darkness outside. Boriviter, his shoulder now healing, finally shared the story of his past. He spoke of a peaceful village, of a life lived in harmony with the seasons. Then he spoke of the soldiers, their blue coats a harbinger of death, their lust for gold insatiable. They had come at dawn, and by noon his world was gone. His parents, his younger sister, lost in a wave of violence that he could not comprehend. He alone had survived, a ghost haunted by the faces of his family. He carried a deep distrust of the white man, a wound that festered far deeper than the one in his shoulder. "They see the land, but they do not understand it," he said, his voice heavy with sorrow. "They take, but they do not give back." Only one man had been different: Ilara's father. Dr. Vance had treated his people with respect, tending to their sick and injured without judgment or condescension. He had seen them not as savages, but as human beings. "Your father," Boriviter said, his gaze meeting Ilara's, "had the heart of a true healer. He planted a seed of hope in a barren land." Ilara, moved by his story, shared her own memories. She spoke of her father's unwavering belief that knowledge was a gift to be shared, not hoarded. He had taught her that every plant, every person, had a story to tell, if one only knew how to listen. Many in town thought him an eccentric. She confessed with a sad smile. "He spent as much time learning from your people as he did reading his books from the East." He said wisdom did not belong to one race. The shared legacy of a man who had bridged their 2 worlds created a profound connection between them. They were the children of his philosophy, 2 different branches grown from the same root of understanding. In that moment, by the flickering firelight, they were not a white woman and an Arapaho warrior. They were simply 2 souls who had known great loss, finding solace in a shared history. A silent understanding passed between them, a recognition of the kindred spirits they were. The walls of prejudice that separated their people seemed to crumble, replaced by a bridge of empathy and respect. The love that was beginning to blossom between them was not a fiery passion, but a quiet, steady flame, nurtured by shared grief and a common hope for a better world. It was a love that promised not escape, but resilience. Blackwood's patience had run out. One moonless night, he and his men surrounded the homestead. The attack was swift and brutal. The first volley of gunfire shattered the windows, sending shards of glass flying into the room. The women, startled from their sleep, dropped to the floor, the terrifying sound of the assault echoing in the small house. But panic did not take hold. They had prepared for this. Ilara, her voice calm and steady, began to issue orders, her mind sharp and clear despite the chaos. They were ready. The siege had begun, and they would not surrender their home without a fight. Eleanor scrambled to the attic, the Winchester firm in her grasp. From her vantage point, she could see the shadowy figures of the attackers moving through the trees. She took a deep breath, steadied her aim, and fired. Her shots were not meant to kill, but to disable, to sow confusion. She forced the attackers to take cover, buying precious time. Downstairs, Beatrice, her fear conquered by a fierce need to protect her sisters, moved between Alara and Eleanor, reloading the spare rifles with a speed and efficiency that would have made a soldier proud. Her small, quiet hands were now an essential part of their defense. Cora, too young to handle a firearm, found her own way to contribute. She had become Borivider's eyes and ears. From a small window at the back of the house, she used a series of hand signals they had devised, a silent language of their own. She relayed the attackers' positions to Borivider, who had slipped out of the house at the first sign of trouble. He moved through the darkness like a phantom, a silent predator stalking his prey. He used his knowledge of the terrain to his advantage, disarming Blackwood's men one by one, his movements swift and silent. He was not a killer but a protector, a guardian of the family he had come to call his own. The firefight raged for what felt like an eternity. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and fear. Finally, seeing his men being systematically neutralized and facing a defense far more formidable than he had anticipated, Blackwood gave the order to retreat. They vanished into the night, carrying their wounded with them. The homestead was safe, for now. But the victory was bittersweet. In the final moments of the assault, a stray bullet had grazed Beatrice's arm, leaving a deep, bleeding gash. The battle was over, but the war for their survival was far from won. The cost of their freedom was written in blood. The attack left them shaken but resolute. Waiting for Blackwood to strike again was not an option. As Alara tended to Beatrice's wound, her hands steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. Borivider spread a worn map on the kitchen table. The flickering lamplight cast long shadows across the hand-drawn lines of the surrounding territory. "We cannot win a war of attrition," he said, his voice low and serious. "We must end this. On our terms." He pointed to a rugged, treacherous area on the map known as the Black Stone Canyons. "We will lure him there." His plan was daring. He spoke of an old tale, a whisper among traders and prospectors of Spanish gold hidden deep within the canyons. It was a myth, but a persistent one. "Blackwood is a man ruled by greed," Borivider explained. "It is his greatest weakness. A story of lost treasure will be a bait he cannot resist." The plan was to spread the rumor through a trusted merchant in Red Creek, a man who owed a debt to Alara's father. The rumor would be designed to sound authentic, a secret whispered from a dying prospector, complete with a fabricated map. It was a gamble, but it was their only chance. Alara looked at the faces of the sisters. She saw fear, but she also saw a flicker of hope. They had been victims for too long. The idea of taking control, of setting their own trap, was empowering. "We will do it," Alara said, her voice filled with a newfound determination. Beatrice, her arm bandaged, nodded in agreement. Eleanor, her hand resting on the stock of the Winchester, gave a grim smile. They would not just defend their home. They would go on the offensive. They would use their enemy's own avarice against him. The decision was made. There would be no turning back. The days that followed were filled with a tense energy. They prepared for the confrontation with a meticulous focus. Borivider taught them the layout of the canyons, drawing maps in the dirt, explaining every rock formation, every narrow pass. Alara prepared medical supplies, her mind already anticipating the potential for injury. Eleanor cleaned and oiled the rifles, her movements precise and deliberate. They were no longer just a group of individuals huddled together for safety. They had become a unit, a family bound by a common purpose. They were ready to face their demons in the desolate beauty of the Blackstone Canyons. The rumor of Spanish gold spread through Red Creek like a wildfire. Just as Borivider had predicted, Blackwood took the bait. A week later, Sheriff Brody rode out to the homestead with a grim look on his face. "He is gone," the sheriff announced. Blackwood and a dozen hired guns rode out at dawn, heading for the canyons. The plan was in motion. Leaving Beatrice and Cora in the care of the sheriff's trusted deputy at a remote ranch, Borivider, Alara, and Eleanor set out. They traveled light and fast, their knowledge of the back trails giving them a crucial advantage. They would reach the canyons long before Blackwood's heavily laden party. The Blackstone Canyons were a labyrinth of shadow and rock. Boriviter moved through them with an innate understanding of their secrets. He led them to a narrow gorge, a natural bottleneck with steep, unclimbable walls. This would be their trap. Working together, they created a rock slide, blocking one end of the gorge completely. At the other end, they prepared their ambush, finding defensible positions among the towering boulders. Then they waited. The silence of the canyon was absolute, a waiting, watchful presence. The sun beat down, turning the rocks into ovens. They waited for nearly a full day, their nerves stretched taut. Finally, they heard the distant sound of horses and men. Blackwood's party, weary and frustrated from their fruitless search, rode into the gorge. Their voices echoed off the canyon walls, their curses a testament to their disappointment. They were tired, careless, and walking directly into the trap. When the last man had entered the narrow pass, a single shot from Boriviter's rifle rang out, the signal. Alara and Eleanor opened fire from their concealed positions, their shots kicking up dust around the feet of the trapped men, preventing them from advancing. The element of surprise was total. Chaos erupted in the gorge. Blackwood's men, caught completely off guard, scrambled for cover. They were pinned down, exposed, and vulnerable. "It is a trap!" Blackwood roared, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. He had been played for a fool, his greed leading him to his own demise. He ordered his men to charge, to break through the line of fire, but it was useless. They were caught in a stone cage, with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. The hunters had become the hunted, and the desolate canyons were about to become the final resting place for their wicked ambitions. The firefight was intense but one-sided. Hidden behind the rocks, Boriviter, Alara, and Eleanor had the advantage of cover and position. Their goal was not a massacre, but surrender. Boriviter's shots were uncannily accurate, striking rifles from the hands of Blackwood's men, shattering water canteens, and chipping away at the rocks they used for cover. He was a master of psychological warfare, his every shot a message of their utter helplessness. Eleanor, her fear replaced by a cold focus, covered the flanks, her steady fire preventing any attempt to break out of the encirclement. Alara, though her heart pounded in her chest, found a strange calm in the midst of the chaos. She was not a warrior, but she was a protector. She fired the rifle with a steady hand, her shots adding to the barrage that kept the attackers pinned down. She thought of her father, of his belief in standing up for what was right, and it gave her strength. This was not just a fight for survival, it was a fight for justice, for the right to live in peace, free from the tyranny of men like Blackwood. She would not falter. She would not fail. As his men fell, wounded or disarmed, Blackwood's rage turned to desperation. He was alone, his hired guns no match for the determined defenders. In a final, desperate act, he charged toward Boriviter's position, a long knife gleaming in his hand. But Boriviter was ready. He met the charge not with a firearm, but with the fluid grace of a seasoned warrior. He sidestepped the wild lunge, using Blackwood's own momentum against him. A swift movement, a twist of the wrist, and the knife clattered to the ground. Blackwood was disarmed, defeated and utterly broken. At that moment, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the canyon. Sheriff Brody and his deputies appeared at the mouth of the gorge, their revolvers drawn. As planned, Alara's friend had alerted them once Blackwood's party had been gone for a full day. They had arrived to witness the final act of the drama. Seeing the sheriff, Blackwood's remaining men threw down their weapons and surrendered. Justice, slow but inevitable, had finally come to the Blackstone Canyons. Blackwood and his gang were taken into custody, their reign of terror over at last. The return to Red Creek was triumphant. The trial of Corbin Blackwood and his men became the talk of the territory. Faced with the testimony of the sisters and the evidence gathered by Sheriff Brody, they were convicted of assault, kidnapping, and attempted murder. The long prison sentences they received sent a clear message. The days of lawlessness were slowly coming to an end. The whispers about Alara and her household faded, replaced by murmurs of respect and admiration for her courage. The Vance homestead was no longer a place of suspicion, but a symbol of resilience. The Pierce sisters, now legally free, chose to stay with Alara. The homestead had become their true home. Eleanor, with her sharp mind and practical nature, took over the management of the small ranch. Beatrice, her arm healed but scarred, discovered a talent for herbal remedies, her gentle touch a source of comfort for all. Cora, her eyes bright with a future she never thought she would have, devoured every book in the house, her thirst for knowledge unquenchable. They were no longer orphans adrift in a harsh world. They were a family, strong and whole. Borivider remained a constant presence in their lives. He did not abandon his people, but the path between his village and the homestead became well-worn. He and Ilara spent long hours together, sharing their knowledge, their stories, their dreams. Their love was not one of grand declarations, but of quiet moments. A shared glance across the dinner table, a comfortable silence as they watched the stars, the gentle touch of his hand in hers. It was a love built on a foundation of mutual respect, a deep understanding that transcended the boundaries of their different worlds. One cool spring evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Borivider and Ilara stood by the grave of her father. The air was filled with the scent of pine and the promise of new beginnings. He did not ask for her hand in marriage in the traditional sense. He simply turned to her, his dark eyes filled with a love that needed no words, and took her hand in his. In that simple, profound gesture, a promise was made. A promise of a shared future, a life built together on the very land that had once tried to tear them apart. The Vance homestead, once a lonely outpost, had become a beacon of hope, a testament to the enduring power of courage, loyalty, and love.